I was 17. The autumn 6 of Harlan Prout's riders came up the Quill Road to run the widow Tabor off her own water. And I have lived long enough now to tell you that I have never since seen a thing as quiet or as terrible as one man standing in the middle of that road with his hat pushed back and his hands hanging loose at his sides, saying a single word to them. The word was enough. He said it the way another man might say good morning, and the 6 of them sat their horses and could not seem to move. But I am ahead of myself, and an old man telling a thing out of order is no use to anybody, so let me go back to the dry of it, the dust and the want, and how it was before he came. That was a drought year in the Quill Valley, the worst any of the old-timers could call up. The grass came in pale and short in the spring and then quit growing altogether by June, and the sky went white and stayed white, and the creek that gave the valley its name fell lower every week until you could walk across it on the stones with your boots dry. Cattle stood in the cottonwood shade with their heads down and would not graze. Wells that had never failed in 20 years gave up mud. Men who had nodded to one another at the Holly store for half their lives stopped nodding, because water had become the only thing in the world, and a man with water and a man without it are no longer neighbors. Harlan Prout had water. Prout had most everything. His outfit, the anvil, lay along the upper Quill where the creek came down out of the high country cold and steady, and he ran more cattle on more grass than any 3 other men in the county, and he had a way of looking at a thing he did not yet own as though it were only a matter of time. He was not a loud man. I want to be fair to the dead and say that. He did not bluster or curse or wave a pistol. He wore a good black coat even in the heat, and he spoke soft, and he smiled a great deal. And that smile was the worst thing about him, because it never once reached up into his eyes, which were the flat pale color of creek ice. What Prout wanted that year was the lower Quill. He wanted the long green bottom where the creek slowed and spread before it left the valley, the one stretch of ground that held its grass when everything else burned, the ground with the deep cold springs that fed it from below so it never wholly dried. And that ground belonged to John Tabor, who was 2 years dead, and so it belonged now to his widow, Della. I had better tell you about her, because she is the whole of why I have anything worth saying. Della Tabor was not from the valley. John had brought her out as a bride a dozen years before, and there were still women in Hollies who, 2 years into her widowhood, called her the Eastern girl behind their hands, though she had buried a husband and run a homestead through 2 drought summers and could shoe her own horse, which is more than most of their husbands could do. She was tall and brown from the sun by then, with her dark hair pulled back hard, and she had a way of looking straight at a man when she spoke to him that some of them did not care for. She was not soft. I want that understood from the start, because the way this kind of story usually gets told, the woman is a frightened thing waiting to be saved, and that was never Della Tabor. She was frightened that year. Anybody with sense was frightened that year, but fear in her came out as flint, not as tears. She had a child, a girl named June, 6 years old, with John's straw hair and her mother's straight eye. And she had me, a half-grown orphan boy she'd taken on after my own folks died of the fever, more out of charity than need, because she could not pay much and there was not much I could do. So that was the Tabor place when the trouble came. A widow, a little girl, a green-broke boy of 17, a dozen head of gaunt cattle, 2 horses, and the best water in a dying valley. Prout started polite. That was his way. He came down himself in his black coat one June evening and sat his fine horse at the gate and tipped his hat to Della and offered to buy the lower Quill, springs and bottom and all. And he named a price that was a good deal less than the place was worth, but a great deal more than Della had ever held in her hand at one time in her life. I was forking hay in the lot and I heard it. I heard her say no. She said it plain, no heat in it, the way you'd refuse a second helping of beans. This was John's, she said. He's buried on the rise yonder under the cottonwood, and June's going to grow up on it, and it isn't for sale at any figure. Prout smiled his smile that died below his eyes and said he understood, and that he hoped she'd think on it, because a woman alone faced a hard road, and the valley could turn unfriendly, and a person didn't want to be alone and unfriended when it did. Then he tipped his hat again and rode off up the white road in the last of the light, and I remember Della stood at the gate a long while after he was gone, not moving, and when she came in to supper her face was set like the face on a coin. It turned unfriendly, just the way he'd promised. It began with little things, the way these things do, so that you cannot rightly say where the accident leaves off and the malice starts. A stretch of our drift fence along the upper line went down in the night, and our gaunt cattle wandered up onto anvil grass, and anvil riders pushed them back rough, and one of our young steers came home with a broken leg I had to put down with the axe, and there was nothing you could prove. Then it was the section of irrigation ditch John had dug by hand to bring creek water onto the kitchen garden and the near hay. We found it caved in one morning, a long stretch of it. The banks pushed in like a horse had been ridden up and down it, and our garden began to die in the heat by the week's end. Della and I dug it out again, the two of us, blistered and silent in the sun, and 3 days later it was caved in worse. And then one morning in July, we walked down to the creek with the buckets, and the creek was not there. I do not mean it was low. I mean it was gone, only a string of drying pools in the gravel with the little fish dying in them, and the green bottom already starting to gray at the edges. Della stood looking at it with the empty bucket hanging from her hand, and June, who had come down with us, said, "Mama, where'd the water go?" And Della did not answer her for a moment, and then she said, in a voice I had not heard her use before, "A man took it." She was right. Cole told me later, when I knew Cole, that it was the oldest, ugliest trick in the cattle country. Pruitt had thrown a dam across the Quill up in the Box Canyon on his own land, where no one would ride, and turned the whole creek into his upper tanks, and let the lower valley go dry as a bone. It was not against any law that anybody in Hollies would enforce, because the law in Hollies that year wore Harlan Pruitt's brand the same as his steers did. There was a sheriff, a fat, amiable man named Dabbs who liked his ease, and there was a circuit judge who came through twice a year and stayed at the anvil when he came, and there was a land agent at the county seat in Calder named Quill, no kin to the creek, just a coincidence of names that the men in the saloon thought was funny, who would notarize anything Pruitt said in front of him. Against all of that, a widow on a drying homestead had about as much chance as one of those little fish in the gravel pools. I have laid all this out so you will understand how it stood the day Cole Marsh rode down the Quill Road, because a man riding into a thing has to ride into something, and this was the something. We were beaten, and did not yet have the sense to know it. The garden was dead. The hay was burning where it stood. The cattle were ribs. Della had been up to Calder twice to see the land agent Quill about her water rights and come home both times white around the mouth and saying nothing. And on this particular morning in the first week of September, with the cottonwoods just beginning to turn at the tips, 6 riders came down off the anvil under Pruitt's foreman, a long-armed man named Galt with a face like a hatchet, and they came not to cut a fence in the dark, but to ride up to the house in broad day and say it out loud at last. I saw them coming from the hayfield and I ran for the house, and by the time I got there Della was already out on the porch with John's old shotgun broke open over her arm, and June was in the doorway behind her skirts, and the 6 of them were fanning their horses out in the yard the way men do when they mean to crowd you. Galt did the talking. He said Mr. Pruitt had been more than patient. He said the lower Quill was wanted, and that a woman who couldn't keep water in her own creek or a fence on her own line had no business calling herself a rancher, and that there was a wagon coming behind them, and that the kind and sensible thing, the thing that would spare everybody trouble, was for the widow to load what she could carry and be gone by the time the sun was over the ridge, and that the matter of payment could be sorted later, fair or unfair, but that the going was not a question any more. He said it almost gently. That was the anvil way, even in the men who worked for it. Della snapped the shotgun closed. I do not think she would have used it. I have thought about that for 60 years, and I do not think she could have, not against 6, not with June behind her. But she would have made one of them pay for the porch, and Galt knew it, And the thing was balanced right there on that edge where a yard goes quiet, and a girl of 6 starts to cry without knowing why. And that was the moment, I swear it on whatever you like. That was the exact moment a stranger came around the bend of the road on a smoke-gray horse and stopped. He just stopped. He sat there 100 feet off and took it in. Heard him come. The dust didn't carry in that still air. He was a lean man past 40, gray coming into a dark beard, in a trail coat gone the no color of long weather, and he had a rifle in a scabbard under his knee and a pistol on his hip. But the thing I noticed even at 17, even scared half out of my wits, was that he didn't put his hand near either one. He just looked. And then he walked the gray horse forward, slow, easy, like a man riding up on a conversation he meant to join. And he came in past the riders and put himself between them and the porch sideways. So he was looking at Galt and Della was at his back. And he pushed his hat up off his forehead with one finger and he said it. Enough. That was all enough, quiet as anything. Galt laughed, but it was a beat too late. He said something about this being no affair of a passing saddle bums, and the stranger ought to ride on while the riding was good. And the stranger looked at him for what felt like a long time, and then he said, still quiet, that he'd been riding through and was looking for work, and that he believed he'd just found it, and that the lady on the porch hadn't sold him on leaving, so he reckoned he'd stay, and that 6 men running a woman and a child off their own ground in the broad morning didn't sit right with him, never had, and they could go on back up to whoever sent them and say so. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't touch a gun. But there was something underneath the quiet of him, some cold known thing, that you could feel like the cold off a cellar door. And the horses felt it before the men did and got to sidling. And Galt's eyes went down to the stranger's loose right hand and stayed there, working it out. And whatever he saw or thought he saw, he didn't like the arithmetic. He covered it the way that kind always does. He said the widow had till the frost then, and the wagon could wait that long. And that a smart man wouldn't be standing where this one was standing when the frost came. And he wheeled his horse, and the 6 of them went up the road in a hard lope with the dust hanging behind them. And the yard was so quiet after that you could hear the dead corn rattle in the garden. The stranger turned his horse around. He looked at Della a moment, at the shotgun, at the girl. Then he looked at the dead garden and the gray bottom and the empty creek, taking the measure of the place, and he said, "You've got no water." Della said he took it. The stranger nodded like that answered a question he'd been carrying a while. He said, "My name's Cole Marsh. You're needing a hand by the look of it, and I'm needing the work, and I'll take found and whatever you can spare, which I expect is little." He said it flat, no charity in it, a square trade offered to a proud woman, and I have come to understand that was a kindness finer than charity, because Della Tabor would have run charity off the place with the same shotgun. She looked at him a long minute. Then she said, "There's a bunk in the barn loft and the boy'll show you. We eat at 6. And that was how Cole Marsh came to the Tabor place and stayed. He was a hard man to know, and I will not pretend those first weeks were anything but uneasy. He did not talk. He worked from before light to after dark and ate what was set in front of him and said his thank you and went to the barn. And he had a way of going still when a question came near anything of his own past, a stillness that closed like a gate so that you learned not to ask. But he could do anything. I had thought I knew ranch work. I learned I knew nothing. He doctored the broke-legged steer's brother that had gone lame and saved it. He mended the drift fence so it stayed mended, with a knot I'd never seen. He took one look at the caved ditch and didn't dig it out the way Della and I had twice. He ran a new line on a grade he eyeballed without ever a level and lined the bad stretch with creek stones laid dry and tight. And when we ever got water again, he said, it'd hold. When he said, not if, and Della looked at him. Because the water was the thing. A mended fence and a sound ditch are worth nothing with a dry creek, and Cole knew it. And one evening that first week, he asked Della plain across the supper table to tell him the whole of it, and she did. She told him about the price refused and the fence and the ditch and the dam in the Box Canyon, and the land agent Quill up at Calder, and how she'd gone to him twice about her water and her title, and come away with nothing but a feeling like she'd been laughed at behind a closed door. And Cole listened to all of it without moving, and at the end he asked her one question. He asked her did she have her deed. She had it. John had been a careful man. She brought it out of the trunk wrapped in oilcloth, the original patent for the lower quill signed by the land office years back, the springs and the bottom and the creek frontage all laid out in the surveyor's hand. Cole spread it on the table and bent over it a long while in the lamplight, and I remember June had gone to sleep against her mother's arm, and the moths were knocking at the chimney, and at last Cole put his finger on the language about the water and said, "This says the creek's yours where it runs through your line, and it says more than that. It says a man upstream can take his fair share and no more, and can't dam the whole of it dry to spite the man below. That's the law of the territory, and it's older than Prout. He doesn't have a right to that dam. He's got a sheriff and a judge and an agent, but he doesn't have a right." Della said, "A right's a poor thing against 6 riders and a wagon." And Cole said, looking at the deed and not at her, "A right written down is the one thing his money can't buy back once enough people have seen it. He can't shoot a piece of paper. He can burn this one, but if there's another up at the land office in Calder that matches it, and the law above the county knows the dam's there, then the dam's the crime, not your staying." He folded the deed back in its oilcloth careful as if it were a live thing. "We need to get to Calder," he said. "And we need to get up that box canyon and lay eyes on that dam, so we can swear to it." That was the night the thing turned, though we didn't know it. Up to then we'd been a widow and 2 half-helpless souls waiting for a frost and a wagon. After that we were people with a plan, and a plan is a kind of water all its own. I will not lay out every day of that month for you. An old man could, but you'd leave before I finished. I'll tell you the shape of it. Cole and I rode up into the high country after the dam, the 2 of us, leaving early so as to come on the box canyon from above where no Anvil rider would think to watch. It was a hard climb and a long one, and on the way up, in the high lonesome where a man's tongue loosens because there's nobody but the wind to hear, Cole talked to me for the first time. Not much, but some. I'd asked him, fool boy, where he'd learned to make 6 grown men sit their horses with one word. And he was quiet so long I thought the gate had closed again, and then he said he hadn't learned it, he'd earned it, which is a different thing, and that he'd been a man who lived by the gun once, down in the border country and other places he didn't name, a man other men sent for, and that he'd been good at it, which was the shame of it and not the pride. And then he was quiet again, and then he said, lo, that he'd had a wife once, Ruth, and that the trade he'd lived by had come to his own door one day looking for him, and that he'd been away when it came, and that he'd come home to find, and there he stopped, and his jaw worked, and he never did finish it then or ever, and he didn't have to. He said, after a while, that he'd put the gun down that day and had not drawn it on a living man since, going on 9 years, and that he aimed to keep it that way, and that the hardest thing in the world for a man who'd lived the way he'd lived was to stand in a thing like the Tabor yard and not reach for the easy old answer. "The easy answer's what made me a man with no wife," he said. "So I don't get to use it anymore. I get to stand there and say enough and mean it with my hands empty. That's the whole of what I've got left to be worth anything." I was 17 and I didn't understand the half of it then. I understand it now. He was not a gentle man by nature. He had made himself one, the way you'd break and gentle a mean horse, with a daily violence done to his own hand, and the gentling cost him more than the meanness ever had. And I think I have thought it a long time that he stayed on at the Tabor place not because a widow needed a hand, though she did, but because here at last was a thing he could stand in front of with his hands empty and be of use, a woman and a child he could shelter without firing a shot, a way to spend what was left of him that didn't add to the count he carried. Della never knew it that whole month, I think, or didn't let herself, but the place changed with him in it. June took to him first, the way children will see straight to the truth of a man past all his hard quiet. She'd ride on his shoulder out to the lot and he'd let her, this killer with his empty hands, and carve her a little horse out of cottonwood. and Della would watch them from the porch with an expression I had no word for then, and have only one for now, which is the beginning of hope, and how a person who stopped letting herself feel it is almost angry at it for coming back. We found the dam. It was a brute thing of logs and rock and packed earth thrown clear across the narrows of the box canyon, and behind it the whole quill stood backed up in a long cold pond feeding off into the anvil's ditches, and below it the bare wet stones where a creek used to run. Cole sat his horse looking at it a long time. Then he took out a little leather book and a pencil stub and drew it, the canyon, the dam, the works of it, the anvil ditches taking the water off, and wrote down the day and where we stood, careful like a man building something. Evidence, he said, sworn to and drawn by two who stood here. He had me write my name under it and the date slow because my letters were poor, and he wrote his under mine. He put the book away. Now Calder, he said. We went to Calder, the three of us, Cole, Della, and me, with June left at the nearest neighbors, the Hendrys, who were small folk Prout hadn't bothered to crush yet because they had no water worth taking. It was a 2-day ride to the county seat, and in Calder is where we learned the worst of it, and also in the strange way of things, where the tide began to turn, both in the same hour. The land office at Calder was a low brick building, and the agent Quill was a soft pink man with ink on his fingers and Prout's money somewhere in his coat. And when Della laid her deed on his counter and asked, polite and cold, to see the office's record of her patent, so she could swear out a complaint against the upstream dam, Quill smiled the smaller cousin of Prout's own smile and went into the back and was gone a long while, and came out and said, "So sorry, ma'am." But there appeared to be some irregularity. He said there was a competing claim of record on the lower Quill, filed proper, signed and notarized, by which it appeared the springs and bottom had been conveyed by the late John Tabor before his death to a party who had since assigned the interest to the Anvil Cattle Company, and that until the courts sorted it, the office could hardly act on the widow's deed, which might, he was sorry to say, prove to be void. I watched the blood go out of Della's face and then come back into it dark. She said John Tabor never signed any such thing in his life, and Quill spread his soft hands and said the signature was witnessed and the law would have to decide, and that these things took years and a great deal of money, and that meanwhile possession was 9 points, and that a sensible person, and there it was again, that anvil word, sensible, a sensible person would take Mr. Prout's offer while it stood. And he slid a paper across the counter, a quit claim already drawn, with a figure on it lower even than the first, and a pen beside it. It was the forged claim Cole had warned of. They'd had it ready all along, a dead man's name on a lie, and the whole machine of the county greased to make the lie stand. And I will tell you, standing in that office I felt the floor go out from under us, because what was a true deed worth against a forged one when the man who counted the votes on which was true was bought and paid for? I looked at Cole. And Cole was looking at the forged claim where it lay on the counter, looking at it the way he'd looked at the dam, taking its measure, and then he asked Quill, in that flat, quiet voice, the date the dead man was supposed to have signed it. Quill, careless, proud of his work, read it off the paper, a date in the spring 2 years back. And Cole said, "You're certain of that date?" And Quill, irritated now, said it was right there in the record, plain as day, and Cole nodded slow, and then he said the thing that broke it all open, and he said it not to Quill but to Della, gentle, turning to her. "That's the spring John died. You told me he took the lung fever in the late winter and was 3 months dying and never left his bed after February. He couldn't have ridden to Calder in the spring to sign a thing, could he?" And Della said, in a whisper, "He never left the house after Candlemas. He died in his bed in May. There's a doctor in Hollies signed the certificate of it, and the burying was witnessed by half the valley. A dead man cannot sign a deed. A bedridden dying man cannot ride 40 miles to a land office. The forgers, in their greed and their certainty that no one would ever dare look, had dated their lie to a season when the whole valley knew John Tabor was already in his grave or going to it. And a thing that will stand against a frightened widow alone will not always stand against a true deed, a doctor's certificate, a churchyard full of witnesses, and one quiet man who knew to ask the date. But the county was Pruitt's, and Cole knew there was no justice for us in Calder any more than in Holly's. So he did the one thing the Anvil's whole machine could not reach. There was a federal land office, the territorial office, above the county in the territorial capital, 4 days' ride east, with a marshal attached to it and a register who answered to Washington and not to Harlan Pruitt. And Cole said we would take it there. The true deed, the doctor's certificate, the sworn and dated drawing of the unlawful dam, and Della's own sworn word and mine. He said it would take 3 weeks there and back, hard riding, and that the frost Galt had named would come before we returned, and that Della would have to choose, right there in the dust of Calder Street, whether to leave the place undefended and ride for the only law that might be honest, or stay and hold the porch with a shotgun and lose anyway. I remember she stood in the street a long while, the way she'd stood at the gate the night Pruitt first came. June was at the Hendrys. The place was 40 miles back, drying and undefended. And she looked at Cole, she'd come to read him a little by then, and she said, if I ride east with that deed, who stands in my yard? And Cole said, I do. She said, they'll come with the frost. There'll be more than 6. And Cole said, I know it. She said, you told the boy you put the gun down 9 years ago and won't draw it on a living man. And he was quiet, and then he said, I won't draw first. I won't draw to kill if there's any other way under heaven. But I'll stand in that yard, Della, and I will not be moved off it, and that's a different thing from drawing, and it's the most I've got to give you, and it's yours. And she looked at this man she'd known a month, this stranger with a buried wife and account he carried, and something passed between them in that street that was past my understanding at 17 and is not past it now. And she said, then I'll ride east, and I'll come back, and God help anybody standing in my yard that shouldn't be. And that was the bargain. It half came apart before it started, because Cole said she shouldn't ride those 4 days alone, and there was nobody to send but me. And that meant the place would have only Cole on it while she and I were gone east, and then only Cole and a hired Hendry boy when we got back and she rode the last of it home. And I will not untangle all the coming and going for you. It doesn't matter. What matters is the shape. That Della and I rode hard east with the papers, 4 days out and the business of 2 more, swearing it all before a federal register and a deputy marshal named Holt, who listened to the whole ugly tale with his jaw getting tighter and tighter, and at the end said, in front of God and the territory, that a dam that dried a lawful creek to drive a widow off a true patent was a federal matter where the water crossed surveyed land, and that a deed forged in a dead man's name was a hanging fraud, and that he would ride back with us himself and look at that dam and that record with his own eyes, and that the whole time we were gone, near 3 weeks, Cole Marsh held the Tabor place alone against the frost. He held it. I had the telling of it later, some from Cole in his few words and more from the Hendry boy and from June, who at 6 saw more than anybody credited. They came twice while we were east. The first time it was a few riders by night to fire the haystack and burn Della out, and they found Cole already in the dark with his rifle across his knees in the lee of the stack, and he never fired it. He called out of the dark, quiet, the way he did, and named 2 of them by their horses, and said the next man to strike a match would answer to him personal, and they sat there in the dark a while and then they rode off, because a thing seen in the dark is bigger than a thing seen in the day, and a man who knows your horse in the dark is a thing to be feared. The second time it was Galt himself with 5 in the day, the way they'd come the first time of all, and they found Cole standing in the middle of the road again with his hands empty and June's little carved cottonwood horse, the one he'd whittled, set up on the gate-post beside him where any rider could see it. And there is no understanding why a thing like that little wooden horse on a gate-post should stop hard men, but the Hendry boy said it did. Said Galt looked at that toy horse a long beat and something went out of him, and Cole said his one word, and they went away again. And the frost came down hard that night and silvered the dead garden, and Della Tabor's place was still hers. We came back with the marshal on the 4th day after the frost. I will never forget riding down the Quill Road with Holt's badge bright in the autumn sun and Della beside me white and silent with the leather case of sworn papers against her chest, and seeing the place still standing, the barn, the house, the little wisp of smoke, and Cole coming out into the yard at the sound of us, and June running out past him and down the road to her mother, and Della off her horse and on her knees in the dust with the child in her arms. And over the girl's head Della looking at Cole across that yard, and Cole standing there with his empty hands at his sides, and the look on his hard face of a man who has been let back in among the living after a long time in the cold. The reckoning, when it came, was almost quiet, the way the truly large things often are. Marshal Holt rode up the box canyon and looked at the dam and wrote in his book. He rode to Calder and put the Agent Quill under arrest before the man could burn a single page, and the forged claim with the dead man's springtime signature came out into the light of day, and stood there next to the doctor's certificate and the churchyard's witnesses for what it was. And Quill, soft pink frightened Quill, with a noose suddenly real in front of him, told the whole of it and whose money had moved his pen, and that was the end of the anvil's hold on the county law. Because a marshal from above the county does not care whose smile dies below his eyes. Holt rode out to the anvil with the warrant, and here is the part I was there for, because Cole and I rode along, Cole at the marshal's word as a witness sworn, and I because I would not be left behind for anything in this world. Harlan Prout met us in his own fine yard in his black coat, smiling. He smiled even then. He greeted the marshal courteous and called the whole thing a misunderstanding got up by a spiteful woman and a saddle tramp, and you could see him already reckoning how to buy or bend even a federal man, the way he'd bought and bent every man before. And Galt was there, off to the side by the corral with his hand near his gun and his hatchet face working, and 3 or 4 anvil riders drifting up, and for a moment the old arithmetic hung in that yard, the same as it had hung in Della's, men and guns and a balance that could tip. And Cole Marsh stepped his gray horse forward 1 step between the marshal and Galt, the way he'd done at the gate, sideways, hands loose and empty, and he looked at Galt, only at Galt, and he didn't say his word this time. He didn't have to. He just looked, and Galt, who had had 3 weeks to think on a man who'd held a place alone against the frost and never fired a shot, a man who'd stood in a road with a child's wooden horse on the gatepost and turned 6 riders by saying enough, Galt took his hand off his gun. He took it off slow and held both hands out from his sides where everyone could see them, and one by one the anvil riders did the same, because the foreman had, and the balance tipped, and it tipped without a shot, which Cole told me afterward in his few words was the only victory he'd had in his whole life that he could carry without it weighing more than it was worth. Prout was still smiling when Holt put the iron on him, but the smile had gone wrong at last, gone down at last into those ice-pale eyes, and there was nothing behind it but a man who had finally come up against a thing his money could not move. They took him to the territorial court, him and Quill both, and the forgery and the unlawful dam and the running of a widow off a lawful patent were all laid out before a judge that the anvil had never bought. And Harlan Prout did not hang. Fraud and water thieving are not hanging crimes, whatever the marshal had growled, but he was broke. He was fined past what even he could pay, and the great dam in the box canyon was ordered down, and I was there with Cole the day a federal crew put powder to it, and the Quill came down out of the high country cold and roaring and free for the first time in a year, down through the dry stones, down into the gray bottom of the Tabor place, filling the springs, filling the new stone-lined ditch Cole had laid that would hold. And June stood on the bank with her wooden horse in her fist and shrieked with joy to see the water come, and Della stood with her hand to her mouth and watched her dead husband's bottom go green again under her feet, and Cole stood a little apart, as he always stood, watching her watch it. The anvil broke up and the land got parceled out, and small folk like the Hendrys got grass at last, and the valley that had stopped nodding started nodding again, because there was water for everyone now where there had only been water for one. They made a kind of legend of it in Hollies, the way valleys do, and most of the legend was about the stranger and his one word in the road, and the legend was true enough as far as it went, but it left out the part that mattered, which was that the one word only worked because there was a true deed behind it, and a marshal coming, and a dead man's grave to swear by. That the standing in the road was the smallest part, and the long, hard, lawful fight to make the standing mean something was the whole of it. Cole knew that. He never let me make a hero out of him. He'd say a hero is a man with a gun and a graveyard, and he'd been that, and it was nothing to want. The thing to want, he said, was to be a man who could stand with his hands empty and still not be moved. That's harder, he said, and it doesn't fill a graveyard. He didn't ask Della to marry him. I want to set that down plain because it matters to who they both were. He'd have ridden on. I believe that. He was a man who did not think he had the right to want a thing as whole as that, after the count he carried, and he'd have saddled the gray and gone east or south, or wherever men like him went, and called what he'd done at the Tabor place a debt paid down on a debt that could never be paid off, and left her land and her water and her girl and her good name, and asked nothing. It was Della who wouldn't have it. She came to him at the barn the evening the water came back, and I was not meant to hear and have always been a little ashamed that I did, but I was a boy and I was up in the loft and there was no help for it. She said his name. She said, "You're getting ready to leave," and he didn't deny it. And she said, "Cole Marsh, you stood in my yard 3 weeks against the frost and you never once asked me for a thing, and I've come to tell you that's the only thing about you I can't abide." She said, "I'm not a woman who needs saving and you're not a man who needs forgiving. I know what you were. You told the boy and the boy can't keep his ears to himself." She said that, and I have never forgotten it, the dry humor of her even then. She said, "I know what you were, and I'm not asking you to be sorry for it the rest of your life on the trail somewhere. I'm asking you to be useful for it here, where there's a girl who's already given you her whole heart and a creek that needs minding and a woman who has buried one good man and is not too proud or too scared to tell a second one to his face that she'd rather he stayed." She said stay, not as a hand. And she put it square to him the way she put everything square, eye to eye, no leaning on him, no falling into his arms, an equal offering a partner a partnership. And she said, "But it's yours to choose. And if you ride out, I won't think the less of you, only the lonelier of myself." And there was a long quiet, the longest I ever heard from him. And then Cole Marsh, who had turned 6 riders with a word and never wept that anyone living had seen, made a sound up there in the dusk that I have only ever heard a man make once, and he said, low and broken and certain, "I'll stay." He stayed. They were married that next spring under the cottonwood on the rise, near John Tabor's grave, which Della would have no other way, because she said John had given her the land and the girl and 12 good years, and she'd not hide him in a corner to spare a living man's feelings, and Cole said he wouldn't want her if she would, which was the most either of them ever said out loud about how the dead and the living can share a single faithful heart. And the creek ran behind them through the green bottom while the preacher read, cold and steady out of the high country, free. I stayed too, years and years, until I had a place of my own up the valley. Cole and Della saw to that, the way they saw to the Hendry children and half the small folk in the quill before they were done. They were open-handed people, the both of them, the way only people who have nearly lost everything can be. June grew up tall and straight-eyed like her mother and married a Hendry boy, and the 2 outfits ran together. Cole Marsh lived out his life on the Tabor place and never once drew a gun on a living man again. And when he died, an old man in his bed, with Della's hand in his bed, mind, after the life he'd led, that was the mercy of it. They buried him on the rise under the cottonwood beside John Tabor, 2 good men sharing the one green hill above the water they'd each in their way given her, and Della between them when her own time came, a long while after, an old woman with the whole valley at her grave. I am the last now who was there. I have outlived all of them, which is a lonesome kind of honor. And when the young ones ask me, the way they do, to tell about the stranger and the one word in the road, I tell it, but I always make sure to tell them the rest, the deed, and the dated lie, and the long ride east, and the marshal, and the empty hands. Because the word enough is an easy thing to say. Any fool can say it. The whole hard glory of Cole Marsh was that he spent the last and best years of a violent life learning how to make it true with nothing in his hands but the truth and his own unmovable feet, and that a proud woman who'd been beaten flat by the richest man in the valley looked at him, and did not see a savior to lean on but a partner to stand beside, and told him so to his face, and that the two of them built a whole green country of a home out of grit and water, and a stubborn refusal to be moved. That's the story. The creek still runs. I can hear it from my porch on a quiet night, cold and steady and free, coming down off the high country the way it has for 60 years now, since the day they blew the dam and the water came home. And every time I hear it I think of a lean stranger on a gray horse stopping at the bend of the road, taking the measure of a dying place and a woman who would not bend, and choosing, with his hands hanging empty at his sides, to stay.